Hi friends, I want to tell you a story today. It's full of surprises and feelings. I hope you like it and want to keep reading. Ready? Let's start. Sometimes family can be very hard. Susan held an invitation in her hand. It was written neatly by her sister Susan. The invitation looked perfect, just like Susan's life. Susan wore a light gray silk dress. She looked at herself in the glass doors of the restaurant. Her makeup was simple and nice. She wore a small pearl necklace, a gift she gave herself when she opened her first restaurant 10 years ago. The restaurant, called Lame Zone, was on the top floor of the Four Seasons Hotel in Boston. It was fancy and had a beautiful view of the city. The place mixed old Boston style with modern design. Susan knew why they chose this place. She heard Susan's husband, Robert Clark, had clients who often came here. At the door, a worker asked, "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" Susan showed her invitation. "The Wilson Clark baby shower," she said. The worker looked at Susan carefully and then checked the guest list. Susan knew what that look meant. Her family probably thought of her as the sister who works at a pub. That wasn't true. It was a lie her family made up a long time ago. Many guests were already inside the beautiful room. Soft lights shone from a chandelier. Women wore fancy clothes and talked quietly, holding glasses of champagne. The tables were covered with white cloth and decorated with light blue flowers. In the middle was Susan, who was 7 months pregnant. She looked like she just walked out of a fashion magazine. She wore a stylish dress and a shiny diamond necklace from her husband Robert. Next to her stood their mother, Jessica. Her hair and makeup were perfect. She wore expensive clothes. They were surrounded by people from the Newton Country Club. Jessica used to be a real estate agent but now cared a lot about her place in society. She had placed strict expectations on her daughters. At least Susan had met those expectations. Susan, on the other hand, had always been a source of disappointment in her mother's eyes. "Well, Susan, you came." Her mother's voice held a hint of surprise and slight disappointment. That tone echoed words repeated countless times in Susan's memories. For the past 10 years, Susan had only met with them once or twice a year at family events. It was a mutual choice. Her mother and sister lived in an upscale suburban neighborhood, active in the nouveau riche social circle. Susan led a quiet life downtown, or at least, that's what her family believed. In reality, Susan was the owner and chef of the high-end restaurant The Hidden Gem, located in a renovated red brick building in the Beacon Hill district. Her restaurant was beloved by Harvard professors and old money families alike. However, she appeared in the media only as Chef Liz and stayed completely off social media. The restaurant's reputation spread solely through word of mouth and gourmet magazines, with a constant 3-month waiting list. But her family knew none of this. As Susan surveyed the room, she noticed place cards arranged on the tables. However, she couldn't find her name anywhere. She noticed Susan's close friends glancing her way and whispering among themselves. They were all from the same private school as Susan and belonged to the same country club. "Is that the sister everyone talks about? She works at a pub, right?" These comments were deliberately loud enough to be heard. Susan took a deep breath and smiled gracefully. Within her heart lay a quiet confidence, matured over 10 years. Susan walked slowly through the venue. The chandelier light cast dancing shadows at her feet. White tablecloths covered the tables, with pastel blue centerpieces arranged elegantly. Many of the guests were familiar faces from Newton's social scene. As she passed by, conversations would pause momentarily, then transform into whispers. Those whispers floated through the venue like a breeze. Susan continued searching for her name card. 10 round tables, each seating 12. Every place had a name card made of high-quality paper. But nowhere could she find the name Susan Wilson. In one corner of the venue, hotel staff were arranging finger foods, smoked salmon, caviar-topped blini, truffle-flavored quiche. Susan noticed slight imperfections in each presentation. A professional's eye never rests. "Susan, even though you came all this way." Susan approached. Her voice carried false familiarity. "You seem to be having trouble finding your seat." Susan simply smiled in response. Behind Susan stood her husband, Robert, sizing up Susan with his investment banker's sharp gaze. "We had a sudden increase in guests, you see," Susan said, putting on an apologetic expression, but her eyes were smiling. "We had to prioritize our important guests." Susan understood the meaning perfectly. She wasn't an important guest. She could never be one. But don't worry. Susan's voice brightened, as if she had just had a brilliant idea. Why don't you try that dingy pub across the street? That might be more your style. Her words spread through the venue like champagne bubbles. Ripples of laughter followed from the surrounding guests. Yes. Jessica approached, a smug smile on her face. That would be perfect for you. Susan took a slow, deep breath. 10 years seemed to pass in an instant, and she realized nothing had changed. After all. I'll do that, she said, smiling gracefully. There was something mysterious in her expression. Enjoy your baby shower. And with perfect posture and elegance, Susan left the venue. Her luxury brand heels clicked quietly against the marble floor. Behind her, her mother and sister laughed triumphantly as new gossip began circulating among the guests. In the hallway, Susan paused by a window. The Boston cityscape glowed in the evening light. Among the buildings, she could see where her restaurant, the Hidden Gem, stood. Susan and her mother watched Susan's silhouette through the window. Backlit by the setting sun, she radiated an almost divine dignity. Yet to her mother and sister, she appeared as nothing more than a pathetic loser. Susan started walking toward the elevator. Her steps were a bit lighter than usual, because she knew the time for truth to be revealed was steadily approaching. After retrieving her jacket from the front desk, Susan left the hotel and crossed the street. Her mother and sister watched with satisfied smiles. However, they didn't yet know that their satisfaction wouldn't last long. As Susan walked toward the pub across the street, she took out her mobile phone. The screen displayed a message from Michelin inspectors, announcing their upcoming visit to her restaurant. A graceful smile played across Susan's lips. 1 week after the baby shower, Jessica was reading the Boston Globe over breakfast. As usual, there was a large headline: The Hidden Gem, Boston's Culinary Treasure. Next to beautiful photographs of the food was the name, Chef Liz. Robert, look at this article. Susan peered over her husband's shoulder. The Hidden Gem, isn't that the impossible-to-book restaurant? The article continued with a detailed introduction to the restaurant. It described how the renovated red brick building in Beacon Hill housed an exclusive space of just 20 seats, decorated with crystal chandeliers and antique furniture. Even Harvard's president is a regular, Robert remarked, impressed. The executives at our bank have been trying to get reservations too, but there's usually a 3-month wait. Jessica read the article carefully. Chef Liz had opened this restaurant 10 years ago, quietly, but steadily, building her reputation with innovative cuisine influenced by her training in France. She had earned 2 Michelin Stars and was aiming even higher. Should we try going? Susan suggested. It's such a famous restaurant, right in our neighborhood. However, making a reservation proved far from easy. They were told they needed a letter of recommendation, and even then, the recommender had to be a customer approved by the restaurant. How pretentious, Jessica muttered in displeasure. The fact that even they, as nouveau riche, couldn't easily access this restaurant wounded their pride. That afternoon, Jessica was shopping in the Beacon Hill area when she happened to pass by the Hidden Gem. The old building softly received the afternoon sunlight. The interior was impossible to see from outside. Then she witnessed an unexpected sight. Susan stepped out of a luxury car that had stopped in front of the restaurant. Though dressed in her usual simple style, her bearing carried an unfamiliar dignity. Behind Susan came a renowned artist Jessica had seen on television. To her surprise, the artist was speaking to Susan with the familiarity of an old friend. Susan, thank you for another amazing meal. I was moved again today. The honor is mine. Thank you for coming. Jessica stopped in her tracks upon hearing this exchange. Susan's voice carried a confidence and composure she'd never heard before. From inside the restaurant, staff members emerged, one after another, bowing deeply to Susan. Their attitude wasn't that of mere colleagues. It was the behavior shown to a respected leader. Chef, regarding today's Michelin inspector visit, a man who appeared to be the sous chef approached Susan and spoke quietly. Yes, proceed as usual, Susan replied, her voice remarkably calm. Jessica watched intently from behind the building. There was no trace of the Susan she thought she knew, that shameful existence who supposedly worked at a pub. Upon returning home, Jessica immediately called Susan. I saw something unbelievable today. Susan listened, confused by her mother's excited voice. I saw Susan going into the hidden gem, and she seemed like a regular there, or even more than that. No way, Susan said, her voice trembling slightly. They desperately tried to recall past events, Susan's reserved attitude, her deliberate absence from social circles, her deep knowledge of cuisine. Fragmentary memories were slowly beginning to make sense. That night, Susan and Robert began researching more about the hidden gem. The restaurant's website only briefly listed Chef Liz's background, no photographs, no personal details. However, gourmet magazine and food review sites were overflowing with praise for the restaurant. Susan found an old gourmet magazine interview. It says Chef Liz trained at a 3 Michelin star restaurant in France until 10 years ago, she read aloud. 10 years ago, Robert pondered. That's when Susan suddenly started distancing herself from the family. Susan opened the baby shower photos on her smartphone. There was a photo of Susan's back as she left the venue. Looking at it now, it wasn't the posture of a defeated person at all. Rather, it was full of composure and confidence. Could we have? Susan's voice was swallowed by the darkness of the room. The next morning, Jessica returned to the hidden gem, this time during early morning preparations. Delivery trucks were bringing in premium ingredients, one after another. Among them, Susan could be seen carefully inspecting each item. Dressed in a crisp white chef's coat, she looked nothing like the daughter Jessica thought she knew. The staff followed her instructions efficiently. There was an unwavering trust built over 10 years. Jessica felt her chest tighten. The daughter she had dismissed as a pub employee was actually a renowned chef, respected by everyone. And they hadn't noticed for 10 years. The truth was revealed 2 weeks after the baby shower. Taste of Boston, the city's leading gourmet magazine, ran a special feature on the hidden gem's 10th anniversary. Susan's photograph was prominently displayed on the cover. She stood in the kitchen, wearing a white chef's coat, a dignified expression on her face. The headline read, "The True Face of Chef Liz, the Truth Behind the 2 Michelin Star Hidden Gem." Susan happened to pick up the magazine in a hospital waiting room. When she saw her sister's photo, she nearly collapsed. After graduating from Boston University 10 years ago, Susan Wilson trained at prestigious restaurants in France. Upon returning to the U.S., she immediately opened the hidden gem as the beloved protégé of legendary chef Jean-Pierre Dot. The article detailed Susan's brilliant career, her rigorous training, her experience at 3 Michelin-starred restaurants, and her fearless entrepreneurship. Everything had been perfectly planned. The cuisine of Chef, aka Susan Wilson, is creative, combining classic French techniques with modern arrangements. Her signature dish, Landscape of Memories, beautifully expresses French tradition while using New England ingredients. Susan was so absorbed in the article that she forgot about her prenatal checkup. There was a side of her sister she had never known. Susan was acclaimed by global gastronomes. The hidden gem was consistently booked 3 months in advance. However, this wasn't merely about popularity. Susan Wilson maintains a policy of welcoming only guests who truly understand value. Reservations require letters of recommendation from existing customers. This strict attitude reflects her sincere approach to cuisine. After finishing the article, Susan immediately called her mother. But Jessica had already seen it. She sat in her living room, trembling, reading it over and over again. Susan Wilson's restaurant isn't just a place for fine dining, it's an intersection of art and culture. Harvard professors, artists, and writers alike consider it their hidden retreat. The article ended with a quote from Susan. "In cuisine, what matters isn't superficial decoration, but essential value, and I want to share that joy only with those who can understand it." Those words felt like a quiet protest. A protest against her family. That evening, Robert attended an executive meeting at his investment bank. An unusual expression of anxiety showed on his face in the conference room. "Is it true that the hidden gem's owner chef is your sister-in-law?" the chairman asked with a smirk. "We've been trying to get a reservation for over 6 months without success. Couldn't you do something through your family connection?" Robert struggled to respond. He had previously claimed that his sister-in-law worked at a pub. He couldn't now acknowledge the truth. "I apologize. I'm not familiar with the details. The conference room fell into a heavy silence. The bank executives' gazes pierced Robert. Many of them knew that obtaining a reservation at the Hidden Gem had become a status symbol. That night, Jessica and Susan met in front of the Hidden Gem. Warm light spilled from the restaurant's windows. Inside, the full dining room was filled with upper-class guests enjoying an elegant evening with Susan's cuisine. What have we done? Susan's voice trembled. That day, telling her to go to a pub. Jessica was overwhelmed with regret as she recalled her past behavior. She had judged her daughter based on superficial values, without ever trying to understand her. And most ironically, Susan had already carved out a firm place in the upper-class society they had so desperately aspired to join. The next morning, Jessica gathered her courage and called the Hidden Gem. When she tried to make a reservation, she received the usual polite response: a letter of recommendation was required. I am Susan Wilson's mother. Jessica's voice trembled. There was a moment of silence on the other end. Please wait while I check with the chef. A few minutes later, the call resumed. We apologize, but the chef has requested that you follow the normal reservation procedure. At that moment, Jessica understood everything. 10 years of contempt. 10 years of scorn. Jessica felt sad and sorry for judging her daughter only by how things looked on the outside. Susan felt the same way. Even though her baby was due soon, she went to the Hidden Gem almost every day. She just watched from outside as the nice smells of cooking came out, and happy customers went in and out. One day, Susan was brave and went inside the restaurant, but Susan wasn't there. A cook politely told her, "We are full today. To get a reservation, you need a letter from someone who already comes here." Just then, Susan came out of the kitchen. The sisters looked at each other. Susan's face was calm, like Susan was a stranger. "Do you have a letter of recommendation, ma'am?" Susan asked. Those words felt heavier than all the hurt from the last 10 years. Susan ran out crying. From far away, she saw the fancy cars parked outside the Hidden Gem, a symbol of the life they wanted, now held by her sister. Meanwhile, Susan went back to cooking as usual. She no longer felt angry, only quiet sadness for a family that didn't understand what really mattered. A few days later, Jessica and Susan found a letter in their mailbox. It was written by Susan on nice paper. The message said, "True value is not about how things look but what's inside, if you are ready to understand." A month after getting the letter, Susan had her baby girl. A flower bouquet arrived in her hospital room. The card said only, "Congratulations," but the handwriting was clearly Susan's. The flowers were simple, with wildflowers from the season. They had a soft kindness that made anyone feel peaceful. It was like Susan's cooking, too. "Mom," Susan said, holding her baby, "what should we do?" Jessica looked out the window without saying anything. She had tried many times to get a reservation at the Hidden Gem, but they always politely said no. Then, another letter came from Susan. "If you want to understand, come work at the restaurant. Start from the bottom. To know what really matters, you must learn the basics." This shocked Jessica and Susan. Their pride wanted to say no, but they had no other choice. 3 months after the baby was born, Susan stood in the Hidden Gem's kitchen, not wearing a clean chef's coat but a dishwasher's apron. Jessica started working weekends as a helper in the dining room. The first weeks were very hard. Susan's hands got rough from the tough work, and Jessica's feet hurt a lot. Susan did not treat them specially. "Things that are valuable take time to understand," Susan said. But slowly, they started to change. Washing dishes, Susan began to feel the care in Susan's cooking. Jessica learned what true hospitality meant by seeing how happy the customers were. After 6 months, Susan got to taste Susan's food at a staff meeting. Tears came down her cheeks. All the feelings Susan had for 10 years were in that dish. A year passed. Jessica was hired officially as dining staff, and Susan became a cook's helper. Their thoughts and values had changed a lot. They no longer wanted the fancy life they had before. Instead, they learned to see what really mattered. Jessica began going to counseling to face her old ways. Susan learned cooking from the beginning and worked with honesty. One night after closing, Susan called them both. "Tomorrow, shall we meet his family?" Jessica and Susan cried at these words. It meant more than forgiveness. It meant starting a new bond between people who understood what really matters. The next Sunday, the hidden gem opened in the morning for the first time, just for Jessica, Susan, and the baby, who was now 18 months old. Susan made a special brunch for them. The dishes were simple, without fancy decoration, but full of deep love. The wildflowers on the table were gentle and kind, like the flowers sent to the hospital. "This is how I truly feel," Susan said as she served the food. "I'm proud you've learned to see what's inside, not just how things look." Outside the window, Boston's streets were bright with morning light. The red brick walls of the hidden gem quietly watched over this new family story. It was a new beginning, born from understanding what really matters.